Hello, Geoff. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Hi, good to be here.
I would love to start this conversation to ask you about this word transformation. Obviously, we're here at the Transformational Learning Summit, but I find it's a word that means different things to different people. And I'd love to
Mm,
start just by opening up a little bit of what your relationship to that word is and what it means to you.
mm, mm. Hmm. Yeah, it's good starting place. We've the work that I've been doing with Pacific Integral is goes back. We're just starting our 20th year, and one of our kind of main programs um, that has been going on since the very beginning of it. That is kind of, in a way, our kind of deepest work that we do. We've sort of added things around it. Uh, But the name of that program has that word in it. The name of the program is Generating Transformative Change. So it's been really in the heart of what we've been doing since the very beginning, and that essence of that, in a way, like many of us, um, comes from a sense of the potential for awakening, the potential for a kind of a change in human social psychological, spiritual experience that can make a real impact in our world and with each other. Um, and as we've kind of grown on, I mean, one of the ways that I think about transformation comes from one of our kind of theoretical frameworks, which is arises out of understandings of adult development, and that is that it kind of we go through many transformations in life. If you look back retrospectively, um, moving from being a toddler to going to grade school is like it's a radical
Mm,
transformation
mm,
as as any of us imagine having. But at the time we don't have any perspective on that. And there's many, in a way, human life is one series of transformations. But for most of life, we're just kind of going down the river. You're kind of not having a perspective that that's happening. And then at a certain point in our growth, we go through a transformation and we have a meta perspective on it. Like we have an understanding that that happened, and then that changes everything.
mm,
That we see, like, oh, I was this person, and now I see the world completely differently. That happened when we were kids, a half a dozen times, but we didn't know that it was happening. We're just like, okay, here we are now, but there's a point where that meta awareness of the shifting nature of our consciousness comes to light. And then all of a sudden that kind of changes the game, because then you understand, like, oh, this happens. This is something that human beings do. They go through these people are not fixed. They go through these rebirths. And then as that evolves, we see that we can start to see patterns with those transformations. We can see, okay, this happens, but it happens in different kinds of ways, and it happens in different kinds of conditions, and we can support that. And then ultimately, if you zoom out from that, you see, like, oh, like, I'm in this sort of transformational journey that you know starts over here at you know the Big Bang or birth or something like that, and who knows where it ends. And ultimately, what at some point might have been a kind of empowering understanding that we can go through transformation also gets tempered by a kind of humility that, like, okay, like, I'm only, if I'm shifting and opening and awakening over time, I'm only seeing a very limited view of what this journey ultimately is. And each one of these kind of transformative changes reveals blind spots that I had, and something,
mm,
a view of the world that was limited. And so and that kind of view to me is beautiful, that we're on this kind of journey and that we can support each other in this. Um, so I'll just say that and see
Mm,
what that how that
mm.
lands in you and
I
where that
love
brings you.
the almost the juxtaposition of what you just offered, of that moment of self-awareness when you discover your own transformation as a process. And you said the word that changes everything, and there's something really potent there in that
Hmm.
it does change something. I mean, it's very subtle but profound and significant.
Yeah,
And then on the other side of that, tempered by the humility of, even in that recognition of awareness, if you really recognize the nature of the process, there is the recognition that there are possibly transformations ahead that will open up new territory, and so there's a certain subtle uh, invitation to humility there, that I
yeah.
guess in some way that the transformation is something that happens to you, that you are an agent of, but is also emergent. So there's an interesting dance there, or with the agency of your own transformation and the limitation of something, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I like what you said, but I particularly like that you ended kind of stumbling to a question mark because
It's like,
I think
where are we
that's
going with this?
appropriate for the topic. Like yeah. I mean, in my one of the our sort of inside jokes is I said something about I said something about that kind of longest running program has the word transformative change in it, and we've been doing this for 20 years, and it's like that work in that program is hardly like what it was when we started. We're hardly like
Mm,
what we were when we started. I mean, uh, you know, I feel in some ways, more connected with you now than I do to the person who started this work 20 years ago. It's like it really is an evolving process that we're in,
mm,
and that's disorienting. I think I want to kind of honor that, particularly when we're in the midst of it, right? Part of um, part of what keeps us grounded and sane is a sense of psychological continuity, you know, and selfhood, and really what we're attuning to here is a kind of deeper process that when you land in it is deeply trustworthy and based in reality, but it's not as tied to you know um, our self-conceptions in the moment. And yeah, so I do what the part that you said about like participating in an emergent process, and you kind of spoke to in your question about the agent of transformation and this kind of larger unfolding, and that's in a way that's a kind of sense making of the process that is evolving as well. But to me, it's one that I really resonate with. It's I think we're part of I think consciousness itself is awakening to itself for the sake of its own realization, and we're growing up and waking up, and that's a process that we're participating in, and we have a role in that. We have a it asks something of us, you could say, and we have our own embodied selfhood as part of it, which has impulses and desires and boundaries, and to express it, that's part of that larger dance. But in some sense, you know, that's also a gift from something larger.
mm. You
So
mentioned that Well, first, I just want to acknowledge that 20 years is a really long time to be delivering a program. And so with that, there's this benefit of really um, being able to learn from that evolution. And I'm curious, what are some of the, if there was a couple of key things that have shifted for you or opened up for you as
Mm,
far as how you think about the program and
hmm.
the aspiration of what the program aims to deliver for participants. What are some of the
Yeah,
biggest things that really shifted for you in that journey?
yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think over time, we could say like the spiritual dimension of our work has deepened. I'm gonna kind of name a few things, and I maybe pick one to go into a little bit deeper. Um, uh, I think I kind of um, our understanding of individual. I'm going to say this in a kind of abstract way. It's very personal, but it's our understanding of kind of individual and collective development and how they co-emerge. It's been a kind of profound learning and growth in the process. Um, I think a deepening of just the simplicity of our work, that very often we'll have a retreat or a program that we're doing, and there's a lot of mixing pieces to it, and complexity to it, and things that we're doing in different times. And kind of my mantra that I often say to the facilitators when we're entering into that is, we're just here to love each other. It's really now, what that entails is, involves some sort of skillful means, but that's really the essence of it, you know is is caring for each other. So it can be kind of going through a deep, complex, nuanced process, or it can just be like bringing somebody a cup of tea. It's really not dissimilar. Um, so they're kind of growing some simplicity, and yeah. But I want to say something about, relationship. I think one of the things that, we're in our work, we really started this work in a way, kind of looking at the situation that we are in as a human family, and kind of entering. Now we're really much more in the midst of it, but at the time we're anticipating being in an intense time of social and change in the world, and ecological change, and and wanting to support people like us to deepen. So our work is really about supporting practitioners of change to deepen in their own practice. And and in that, the starting point often in this kind of work is we're creating a kind of process or a container for that work. And then people are entering into that and going through their own growth process. And that's the sort of, so in a way, we're kind of creating the collective environment for individual change. But what we saw over time is that in order, what we really need in a larger sense is to understand how those collective spaces and our individual growth cohere and co-evolve and co-emerge together. So the work has taken on much more an emphasis of helping people create their own containers for their own transformative process, and containers that evolve. It's kind of what we've been doing. We've been hanging in this for 20 years, and both the space that we work in and ourselves individually have kind of been co-evolving. So that's a deep part of the work, and a deep learning over that time.
Hmm. I have a lot of questions here. I'm just I
Yeah,
think I'll toss two at you, and then you can sense into how
I'll
you
try
might
to keep it
approach
simpler.
them. Yeah. So one question is just It's related to the nature of what you've learned and whether it would have been possible for you to have the relationship that you have with the work that you do 20 years ago, if someone could have somehow conveyed some understanding to you that you could have had without having gone through the process that you have, the direct experience in a way that now it's like tacit and probably embedded and embodied in you in a deep kind of understanding. So I guess the question are there elements of what you understand today that could be shortcutted to a person who wants
Mm,
to do the work?
mm,
And I'll put the second one there, but I think we'll get to the second one next, which is really about container. You use this word container,
mm-hmm,
I'd like to go into a little more about what you
mm-hmm.
mean by that, what container means to you, and what it means to create a container for a process. But maybe we can start with the shortcut first.
Yeah. Um, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that one before, but here's what comes to me when you said that. When you say, "Is there a way to shortcut this for people who've been doing the work?" Right? Which is, so this is a non-answer. I'm continuing in a series of non-answers.
Thanks.
You're getting to know me. Uh, no, it's like like my response to that is just to do the work, and to learn and to give your heart and your spirit to it. It's like it's a time when we need that. And so that, yes, there's things you can shortcut, but I would say for the most part, most of what I work with in that realm with people is there's a deep sense of purpose and um, knowing and gift that wants to come through, and the layers of hesitation around that, or uncertainty, or um, hesitance. I don't know what you want to call that, but like, so trust that. That's what comes to me. It's not really that is the super shortcut, right? Which
Trust.
is to actually trust and dive in deeply, and um, support yourself in the process. Make sure that you're cared for, and you have what you need in life to thrive. And but you know there's something to give here, and that's the shortcut. The part that you can't shortcut is everything that comes after, all the you know all the dealing with your own shadows, and learning, and cultivating wisdom, which takes time. And but engage, that's the shortcut. It doesn't really matter whether it's a shortcut or a long cut. Just when you do the work, you're making a difference for people, and that will have an impact beyond what you know.
Hmm.
So that's maybe um, words of encouragement.
I think it speaks to the simplicity of what you're talking about as well, because I guess from my vantage point, a lot of it does come down to presence and kindness in one way or another, becoming present to
Mm,
yourself, to another person, and then
yeah,
caring and bringing that into direct experience. And there's
yeah,
something about that is deeply transformative for people in almost any context. Um, and that doesn't require years of study, but years of practice does something to you for sure.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, the other thing that, yeah, I would say is that, if you're engaging in transformative work, then the deeper practice is to be an honest participant in that process. To know that you are on your own developmental journey, and and to be humble in that. And I mean, just saying that maybe it's simple that the work is to care, but what is it? What's actually care, what actually makes a difference for people, but how you engage in relationships with people that are intimate and deep, but also respectful, radically respectful to their own existence and their own experience of themselves. That that's like a lifelong work, and that's part of the reason that that I've done this for 20 years. Is it's just like when you really engage in your own journey like that, there's like, what else is there to do? In a way, it's a learning process. I'm learning with everybody that I'm working with, and with the participants in our programs, um, and in community with them, and so you know uh, there is a lot to say more in detail about how
Mm.
the work is done, and the approaches and the practices and the frameworks and all of that. There's a lot of rich dimensions to our work, and we've done research and written papers and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm talking kind of more on the simplicity side of it, but that's kind of an expression of the simplicity too. It's just like that's stuff that I'm interested in.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I learn, and I'm drawn to, and my heart is moved to, to you know, discover more and share that.
So let's talk about this container thing. As
Yeah,
you used that word
good.
earlier, and I feel like that's kind of maybe also grounding something into something very tangible and specific. And I'd love to um, hear some of your reflections on how you anything mm, anything that you might consider unique in your understanding of what a container really is,
Mm,
and maybe how that concept has evolved and emerged for you over over the time that you've been doing this kind of work, and how
hmm.
you approach it today.
Yeah, it's a really important part of our own kind of exploration. Um, so I want to zoom out a little bit, and then come back to that specific kind of question about container, which is, and this kind of refers to a kind of theory that we bring into our work, as part of the kind of human development um, model, which is, you might think of kind of like well, in some traditions, there's this kind of terms of the kind of concrete, subtle, and causal, or gross, subtle, and causal. You can think of it as kind of body, mind, spirit, um, territories of depth. So in ourselves, and that also happens in our collective space. So this, kind of setting up something to talk about container. So you can think of a container in a way, in that kind of middle territory of what we call the subtle collective, which is when we are in a relational space, that where we start to see the relationships less in terms of the individual, or the the particular organization that we're in, or something like that, than the quality of the space itself, the quality of the relational dynamics, or the how we are being with each other. So that's what we call kind of subtle community and subtle collective. So there's the concrete collective, which is a kind of earlier form of collective, which is like like right now, you and I are talking. So it's Geoff and Lorenz. It's not like two other people, right? This is us, right? And we're now we're kind of adding something to our particular relationship. So the concrete collective is that kind of um, like family or organization. All the people who are working on sutra, your primary relationship, your family that you're visiting right now. That's like those people, their particular connections that you have. And what we're doing right now is we're engaging in a kind of subtle container, right? Which is that kind of the quality of the conversation that we're having. So like you and I kind of agreed like that we're going to allow the conversation to unfold. So that's a quality of our container that we have, right? So that's subtle. And at the concrete, we're like making a memory together between you and me, not between anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So that the subtle container is that quality of the field that you create. And we could drop two other people into this and facilitate this similar kind of quality, right? And you can take, and this is the thing, like this kind of subtle community or cultivating the quality of the field is a kind of the leading edge in a way of this kind of work. So you can take a bunch of people and bring them into a room and have a really kind of deep connection, and they'll fall in love with each other, but they won't really know each other's names or what they do for work. You know, the concrete part is not there so much, right?
Mm.
But it's powerful. You know, it's like that's working at a more kind of subtle level. So there's all sorts of things you can do to kind of cultivate that subtle container. So two things from there is there's a kind of another level of collective, which beyond that, which might be, you know, we call it the kind of metaware, which comes from our one of the theories that we work with, but it's the larger field, like the larger cosmic field, you could say. In a way, that's the ultimate container. So that larger field is also a collective environment, and there's an attunement and a connection to that we can cultivate, and an awareness of that we can cultivate. And then at the other end, and this is something that I feel I have felt passionate about in our work, is that I think we've lost a lot of that concrete relationship, like at the physical level with each other, at the level of actually building friendships and connections that endure over time, of going through the ups and downs of something with particular important people in our life. In the society as it's constructed now, we've lost track of that. We could say like lost track of that, you know, in modern Western cultures, but particularly I think in, you know, the last 10, 20 years, with the advent of our social virtual connections, we've lost contact with that. And that's something that we really work with, is actually when you come into our work, you know, a lot of it is about real relationship between people, you know, getting enmeshed in each other's lives, because that's really a foundational piece of the work that supports the work that we do.
Mm.
So that, just to kind of review it, that sort of concrete and subtle and that larger metaware or transpersonal, those are three dimensions of that collective environment that we're in, and that middle territory of the subtle container of how we cultivate our awareness together, the agreements we have about spaces that we're in, the practices that we do together that open different kinds of possibilities with each other. That's when I say container, that's kind of what I'm referring to.
Mm. Mm.
And
So
does that all respond to what your question?
yeah, it's really interesting, and I appreciate the the leveling of it, of this concrete, more subtle nuance, and then the cosmic nuance, which is also really
Yeah.
interesting to bring that into the awareness of it, the inquiry of it. Um, so two things coming up for me here. One is just maybe a more explicit articulation of the construction of that, you know, in a group space. I guess, you know,
Yeah.
before we started this call, we spent a few minutes talking about what we might talk about and the territory, and exploring, you know, what would be interesting to include in this conversation. So that's,
Yeah.
we created a container for the space here, and that was also kind of contained within the broader container of just our very soft working relationship. It's not like we spend a lot of time we've spent a lot of time together, but we have like a subtle working relationship, and so there's the broader
Yeah, that's
container
that
there.
subtle container. Like there was like trust we were able to cultivate quickly with
Hmm.
each other. Yeah.
Is the so on the cosmic level, does that have a connotation of also of being receptive to what wants to emerge, almost in the theory U context of what wants to emerge here? Would that be something that comes from that level, or is that relevant to this conversation of container that we're talking about?
Yeah, no, that's relevant. It's that kind of wider transpersonal dimension. It has an individual and a collective kind of aspect to it. We can take that kind of view of it, that perspective of it. And and we've been kind of referring to this without naming it at different points in the conversation where we're talking about like we're participating in something larger than it. Is a transformation something we're doing or something that we're participating in?
Mm.
And that begins to kind of expand beyond, into something beyond the self. Um, and and that the personal dimension of it is when you say what's the future that wants to emerge is that kind of that sense of something emerging in us beyond our personal mind, that sense of our presence or awareness beyond our individual selves, beyond our ordinary self, our contact with something we might call spirit or awareness or um, that transpersonal dimension. And when we start to ground in that, we the experience is kind of like what you're pointing to. That that at first it's a kind of listening to what wants to emerge. So in the you, in theory, at the bottom of it, you let go into something bigger than yourself, and then the question that's at the bottom of the you is like, who am I now, and what am I here to do now? And but it's not coming from here; it's coming from something beyond the self, and and so that's kind of the individual relationship to that kind of transpersonal dimension or some intimations of it. And then there's as that deepens, we begin to see that there's a wider, like all of this in a way is a kind of process that we're participating in. It's not just this, what's happening in the room here, but it's the whole field of consciousness itself that is unfolding. And that's the larger container.
Mhm.
So, but I don't know, this is just me giving some words to something. Um, it so it's important to hold this lightly, to understand,
Mm.
to describe something like this is really beyond words. It's, mostly people who describe it well use poetry and silence and things like that.
I do like this dimension of, well, the question that's coming up for me, or the reflection, is really about um, so I want to maybe acknowledge that in this space of doing this kind of what might call transformational work, this word container tends to be used a lot,
Yeah.
and so I find it's very foundational to almost any transformational process,
Yeah.
and the word transformation can also be this big word, anywhere where you're inviting people into meaningful intimacy and connection. I feel like there is a context of a container that holds it. What I appreciate, or around what you're sharing, or maybe the question or the reflection, is um, the extent to which bringing awareness to that, the subtlety of the container, actually somehow feeling it, like you and I having a conversation. And so in some sense, there's the concrete aspect of, like, we're making a memory, we've agreed to talk about certain
Hmm.
things. But there's a more subtle dimension that in the moment to moment experience of, you can notice that there is a certain and this maybe speaks to the less describable aspects of the container, that there is a certain energetic quality here, a space of this conversation, that can easily go by unnoticed, but by noticing it, it actually somehow reinforces the process. And I wonder if that's something that you think about in a group space, that you kind of create the container, but that you throughout the process invite people to begin to somehow
Yeah,
notice their sensing of or what is present to them in that context.
yeah. I love what you're bringing forth. Yeah, it's yeah, there's so much to that, what you're saying. Absolutely. Like you're speaking to the subtle quality um, of the field, and and that in and of itself is something that's like an aspect of the container. There's there's a lot like that. That there's a lot to what constitutes that container, but you just pointed to something that's quite subtle and beautiful. And another thing that you pointed to for me is like when you point out something like that, in a way um, you're giving voice to the collective. Like a lot of times, especially in kind of a lot of the sort of postmodern contexts that we come in and into these kind of spaces, people are in more of an I space. Like you have a question, that might come to like how I'm experiencing something or what's happening with me right now. But you just said, oh, maybe look, can you feel this collective feel? There's a kind of quality of being in our space right now. And that's in a way, maybe that's a perception that you have, but also you're giving voice to us. And that in and of itself is a really powerful skill for a collective to develop, to have its own. Like if you think about it, like you have a kind of metacognitive awareness, in these territories of development, where we can often say like, oh, I notice you're looking at me with a face that reminds me of my father, and I'm feeling, like anxious, like you're gonna make some joke about me, like you used to do, like
Mm.
I'm aware of my own process, and then I can go like, okay, I can see that, that's a kind of wound that I have. I'm familiar with it. So this is kind of meta awareness that's happening. And one of the things you can do in that field is in a container is to cultivate the capacity of the collective to have its own collective meta awareness. So like if you say like, can you feel like we just as a collective pause after something, you know, poignant was said and went into some stillness, and can you feel this field? And and you'll notice in the collective how what response that has. Like, you might be like, "Are you crazy? Like, I don't feel that. I'm mad." Everybody's like, "Yeah, I can feel that." So there's a kind of the collective itself is like becoming self-aware, or it could be, do you notice this pattern where like, every time Loren says something, we stop and take it seriously, but every time Geoff says something, we kind of skip over it. Like that's another kind of collective
Mm.
self-awareness, and that gives voice in the collective. So that's a part that I really picked up on. And what you said was not just the quality of the field, which is subtle and beautiful, but
Mm.
that you're naming it, you know,
Mm. Mm. Mm.
and that takes some courage, to name things. especially things to speak freshly about what's happening, not just in our usual habitual patterns of saying what's going on, but to speak. And for different people, it's different. Like maybe for someone, that might be an edge to say something kind of more like subtle or spiritual, like of their own perception. Other people, it might be more of an edge to say something like about emotional or relational dynamics in the space. But to name that, that's a huge, that's a quality of the container itself, not just the field, but the self, collective self-awareness and willing to express that, to be, to be, um, to embody it at a collective level, its own awareness.
Hmm. And also naming it is a way for the learning to happen,
Yeah,
with a group of people. Like you said,
yeah,
sometimes like someone says something poignant, and maybe there's someone in the group who doesn't feel feels or whatever, but nonetheless, when something poignant is said, they likely do feel something, and just noticing that, oh, there's something that's being felt there,
yeah,
or if there's some sort of dynamic, like an imbalance or something that comes up consistently, it's easy to be subject to that as a collective, and then naming it kind of makes it something that we can now see as a
yeah,
as an emergent learning process. And I think that's part of what I'm hearing here is that part of what's difficult to articulate about this kind of experience is that it's the emergence itself that, when attended to, offers the soil for discovery and learning.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really important point.
Mm.
I would just add to it that there's an embodiment aspect of it too. So there's a kind of learning in the sense of self-reflection that allows something to surface to be worked with. And there's also a self, a self-expression of, like when we speak a real truth, we land more deeply in ourselves,
Mm.
because there's something that's, that's if there's any hesitation to express, or something that's not fully embodied about the sense of who we are. So if there's an important truth to speak and I speak it, it's like, okay, that is a profoundly transformative act, right? Same with collective, like there's a point in collective life where someone will say, like, this is who we are, and people will, and if it's true, if it's speaking the truth, this will help deepen and land what the collective is, and then the collective, it's like going into the collective body. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, but not in an intellectual way, because
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it does is in
Can I add
say
something?
a little more. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm chuckling because it's a little weird to talk about this in kind of Western context, because there's so much individualism. We're
Hmm.
like we're like swimming in a sea of individualism, talking about containers and collective life, and you're you've lived in different places in the world, so you've I'm sure encountered parts of the world that have more of a collective culture, and we've run our programs in some of those places. We ran our program for a few years in Africa, and I'll say this a little bit like humorously, but when we run the program here, you get a group of people in the room, and it's sort of, they look around at each other like, okay, I'm taking this program, I'm not sure who these people are, like, oh, they're telling me that we're doing collective work. Okay, we'll see how that goes. There's like a hesitation to really come together. I'm overblowing it a little bit, but that's there's a there's a truth to it. Like at that point where groups really come together, it's profound,
Hmm.
and I think it's part because we live in an environment where there's a certain degree of alienation from relationship and communal life. But in a collective culture, what we encounter more is, when a group first comes together, what you'll hear is, if someone says like, well, why are you taking this program? Well, here, in the US, we might hear more like, well, I'm here because I want to develop myself in this way and I want to deepen my work and I've got these issues that I'm working with. And when we ran the program in Africa, we'd hear something like, well, I'm here so that I can be of deeper service to my family and my community and my country. And pretty quickly, sometime usually on the first day at some point, the group will just start dancing together and laughing. They don't know each other. It's just more right there. And so when we're talking about embodying the collective, it's a little bit. That's why I was kind of chuckling, just because it's a little bit harder to presence that sense of. Here in the West, we know it more like when we go to a concert or a football game. All of a sudden, we're like, our hive mind gets switched on, and all of
Embodiment
that
of
like
collective
mistrust and
consciousness.
everything goes away. Like all of a sudden, we're
Like these
dancing together
peak
and we're laughing,
experiences.
and but collective experiences, right? And but that in the containers that we create, it's that moment that I'm speaking about of actually learning to cultivate that quality of deep coherence and unity and sense of we. Yeah. So when I was saying, when we name something in the group that as a deep truth about the collective, that supports that.
And
yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of also what I meant about it creates an opportunity to create a correlation, because it's like the data, the experience is there. This experience of the collective body is implicitly there, and then the naming of it, the bringing awareness to it, creates an opportunity to correlate the mental process with the embodied experience. It's like, oh, that's what that is. It's that I can feel you, I can feel this collective, and now you've just brought my awareness to that capacity, and there's something there that's really difficult to articulate and formulate outside of the direct experience of the process. Because if you're trying to tell someone about it who has no prior or direct experience of it, it's kind of like, sounds really abstract and wishy-washy. What are you talking about? Right. And then in the moment, when you kind of repetitively begin to have this experience, you're like, oh, wow, like there is a there, and it's quite profound.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a moment a couple of years ago in a group, cohort group that we were working with. This is a kind of smallish group, maybe about 16 people or something like that, and they were kind of deep into the process after months, working together, and there was one individual in that group whose own personal journey was really about uncovering his separation from others. He said after the program, he said it probably like saved his marriage, and like there was a really coming out and into himself and out into relationship, and that was really deep. And there was a moment, and this was a kind of humorous moment, but he was standing up in the group, and he said, and we were in the midst of some process, I don't remember what, and he said, this is about real relationship. I didn't sign up for this. He
Was he serious or
kinda,
joking in that moment?
he was not serious that he didn't want it. He was acknowledging that it was just what he needed, but also that he didn't really see it until that moment, and that was, and the important thing there is that everyone like resonated with that comment. They were in it with him. Like, this is about real relationship, whatever that meant in that group in that time. So that was also, that was a kind of statement like what you're saying about like, oh, acknowledging something that's happening right here, right now with us. And then it becomes who we are. Like that's what we are. We're
Mm,
about real relationship here because we acknowledge that, we put it to words, and when you give it voice, there's something about it that in the weird nature of the human experience that brings it more into reality. You
mhm,
know, like in the beginning there was the word, like it actually gives voice,
mm.
and in that voice manifests something. That's just, I just want to give a kind of example of what I think we
Mm.
were talking about. Yeah.
I love that. For you as a facilitator, and maybe this is less so now, maybe it isn't, I don't know, but I'm curious um, about how your relationship with uh, leading an emergent process has evolved. I find for me there's sometimes a pressure, that the right thing needs to happen, or that the participant feels like they're getting value, or the pressure that an emergent process won't emerge into the right territory. Even and the reason I mean I'm really like speaking from uh the moment to moment experience of recording a conversation, right? In that there's this background, there's one aspect of it which is go with the emergence, and then there's the other background aspect of it, which is the conversation heading in the right direction? Is the conversation kind of remaining within the context of relevance to the audience? So there's a dance of awareness there with for me personally in recording these kinds of conversations, which is there's the emergence of it and going with the richness of that. And then there's this
Yeah.
part of that either is afraid that it will go totally off rail, and or just an attentiveness to the directionality of it, that it's, because
Yeah.
obviously we could go in a million different directions and have a great
Yeah.
conversation, but it wouldn't necessarily
Yeah.
be within the context of what we're here to do.
Yeah. 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 um, yeah. Well, with that example, I have to come up with a very very down the middle answer.
Good times.
Here are the three keys. Um, yeah, no, I mean, you started with the question of like what my own kind of evolving relationship to being in the space of emergence. I think that was
Yeah.
what
Like
you're
guiding
asking, and
an
then
emergent.
no, like what you're describing is like really really relatable. Like that, um, and you know, um, like I think that for me that maybe a part of the learning is that thought that comes into your head, is this on track, or the impulse to go in this direction or that direction, and then wondering should we just allow it to unfold. In some sense, your own impulses and thoughts and discernment as a facilitator is part of what's emerging,
Mm,
right? It's not just what's emerging out here, it's also emerging in here. So, if what's emerging in you is to say, you know, hey, Geoff, can we speak more concretely about, something that's emerging, right? So the question is more like a conflict between the outer sense of emergence and your own discernment, one's own discernment, than like, kind of becoming aware of where the impulses come from, like
mm,
if it's coming from some sort of anxiety about, or self-doubt, or like habitual pattern about, how conversations should go, or some of deeper sense of discernment about what's needed. It's more to kind of tuning in outwardly and inwardly to what's most important. And that's just that's just a practice. um, which cultivates by, continuously getting it wrong, in some ways. And so, you know, yeah, yeah. I mean, like I really relate to what you said, I'm, like sometimes I can be really tuned into like my own kind of discernment and awareness. And so at this point in my work, my practice is really to do that. It's really to kind of tune into my deeper knowing about what's needed and follow that. But I've got parts of my mind and my emotional body that are just going like, what are you doing? What are you doing?
Mm.
Like that's too edgy. That's, like, and it's just like, I'm just kind of aware that that's happening, I mean, it's not always happening, it's like, but it does happen sometimes. I have self-doubt and question, you know, ask my partner, was that okay? What I did there,
Mm. Do you,
like,
do
it's
you
just
feel,
part of it. We're human beings.
do you feel like I'm curious about the, in cultivating this capacity? And so one of the um, ways that one of the ways of many different complex ways that my capacity has been cultivated is that sometimes when I've been in a situation where I've had a particular discernment but not necessarily been clear or had different options to move forward with, that I would just pick an option to see what happens, to learn from that,
Yeah.
be like, okay, I'm going to prototype a response here and kind of see what happens, but do so very intentionally, in a situation where they're kind of there's a
Yes.
discernment that gives me that optionality. And I wonder if that's also then part of how you've learned, by kind of intentionally picking paths, but then really observing what happens.
So important what you're saying, you know, like if you think about like the original way you framed the question and the way, kind of some of my response to it, there's more of a attention on the self, right? Like, should I go with emergence, or, like the mental process? And in where you just went with it, there was more like I perceived an attention on what was happening out here. Like, okay, I'll try this, but then I'm going to watch and I'm going to be in relationship and
Mhm.
adapt and respond. And to me, ultimately, that's what's really helpful, is to really, really just attune, stay attuned to others and with people in what's happening, really with them in the process, and if you're bringing something that isn't helpful, like if you're with them, like we're all human beings. We're not perfect, right? But if you can just be in the process with that kind of sense of experimentation and reciprocity and an honest, care for the well-being of
Mhm.
others, then that goes a long way. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
I want to maybe jump to a slightly different territory, which is the nature of doing this kind of work online. And
Mm,
um, I, I, I mean, I'm assuming that 20 years ago, when you started doing the GTC program, it was mostly in person. And I'm curious, and actually, I'm making a huge assumption there, but I'm curious how the online aspect of your work has evolved, and um, how how you approach that. Anything in particular you've learned about doing this work, this kind of transformational work, effectively online?
yeah, yeah, it's a really good topic, and it's important. Um, we've always had an online component, like 20 years ago we do work that's kind of comes together. Now we're doing work that's just purely online, but we also do work that's in person. But our work is quite, unfolds over time. We tend not to do kind of one-off workshops. I tend to do things that create and cultivate practice spaces. So that involves, even if it's in person, like in the GTC program, we have over 9 months. We have um, 4 retreats, residential retreats. So it's a big time commitment, but in between those retreats, we're doing things online. And yeah, back 20 years ago, we were doing that. We we used an online platform that was, essentially kind of a forum system. And that's evolved over time. And it just personally, it's something that I've been involved with technology since I was young. And, I've been interested in this topic since the beginning. I was kind of involved in online spaces back in the 80s, And so, what would I say about it? Like, I think in part, well, I think that, part of the problem today, in a sense, you said early on we were, there's probably less of it, as if that was a less desirable kind of situation than now. But I think part of the problem is also that there's just so much of it now,
Mm.
I mean, like part of the context is that a lot of what we're hearing and reading about online social environments is the harm that they're doing, both socially and personally. And so, and a lot of people, it's kind of a common complaint, like, I mean, I have like, if you counted all the different apps and groups and, I mean, it's like dozens, and so there's just so much going on. But the way that I just described that is just sort of like an amorphous blob, because that's in part, I think, where I see people coming into this work is like, oh, I have to engage with an online platform. So part of the work is actually helping people move through that and in a way allow the technology to kind of float to the background and disappear. So when we do things that are live, a lot of what we're doing is actually cultivating connection, and as if somehow, like right now, we're looking through a screen at each other, and but if somehow we could let that disappear and imagine that we're in the room with each other, and to actually allow the technology to kind of recede to the background. And to me, I think I mean, it's not I'm framing it in a way as a kind of in contradictory terms, but I think there's a paradox to it. Like we're going to go deeper and deeper and deeper into technology. But I think in some ways we have to learn discernment there too, and to allow a lot of what's kind of spontaneously grown in our technological garden to get weeded out and to have it be simpler at the same time. And so part of our work when we're using our platforms is to try to discover things that help people connect through the technology and allow the technology to kind of recede into the background.
Mm. Is there anything specific that you've discovered that, I mean, usually I feel like when it comes to an online setup, there's the content and then there's the possible social engagement aspect of it. And at least from the conversations I've had with people who are doing something online, they want to feel like there's good engagement in the online space,
Mm-hmm.
and or the participants are not overwhelmed by that they're not overwhelmed by the
Mm-hmm.
burden of participation, but that they're getting value out of it.
Right.
And I wonder if there's anything specific that you have um, discovered or learned, any specific
Mm-hmm.
techniques or strategies
Mm-hmm.
towards that
Yeah.
online piece.
I mean, just what you said, I think, making the issues explicit and part of the conversation has been essential for us.
Mm.
Like that, which, which at first is a kind of just validating, the complexity of online engagement and making space for, like learning with others about what works for them. And then over time with groups, it's having them take on more collective responsibility for how they engage with each other.
Mm.
so it does, so it's not merely seen as a kind of like, here's the system, here's what you're supposed to do, but and this is true about all the aspects of our work, because when you come into any, you click a button and you come into a program, it sort of fires the neurons that, got coded in 18 years of, conventional schooling, like I'm in a class, they're giving me something, what am I supposed to do? So like opening people's own agency, and that makes a big difference, like
Mm.
there's always some point in our work where someone will pick some random tool, like in a program that we're doing right now. It's like some people decided they want to do Marco Polo with each other, right? And
Mm.
so, you know, we could say like, well, that's not an official approved application, and you should be posting on Sutra, but
Good
that's where
luck with
the energy is. So,
that.
so
Right.
having some like, like understanding that community and connection just happens in lots of different ways, and it's not, you're not the architect of it, but to be aware of it, and like open people, or just talking about, there's often a point in our work where we will have a process, and then a conversation will open up in a group about like, well, how do we want to work with this? What agreements do we want to have? Am I supposed to respond to everything that you post? You know, so just opening up people's agency and supporting that, I think is important. And also understanding that there's difference, in how people work with these spaces. Some people love to be online, some people love to write, some people don't love to write, some people, you know, are more, it's just working with all of that in some way. Um, I one of the things that I'll just say, one other thing, which is one of the things, so we haven't been using Sutra that long, but one of the things that I really love about it is what, I don't know if you use this kind of terminology, but I think of it as kind of a document model. It's a, you can create a page and kind of do anything that you want with it, as
Mm.
opposed to some other platforms that we've used, which are more like plug in these 5 pieces of content and it comes up looking like a folder or something like that. And that that openness, at first when we started using it, that openness was like, okay, well, we're starting with a blank page. This requires more thinking and work. But that's actually really, really good. I think that part of what can help us work with connecting online um, is to pay more attention to aesthetics and to the freshness of our turning towards the freshness of our mind. I'll put it that way, which means not just repeating a pattern, but um, actually coming, and this is kind of quality of the container too, but coming into this context, this moment, and finding our own way of expressing it, our own words, our own imagery, you know,
Mm.
um, and because I think part of what we're struggling with technology is it's kind of having us practice a pattern way of thinking and relating. That makes sense, and that will cause us to go asleep.
Mm.
That like, oh, relating involves posting and responding and liking, posting and responding and liking, right? So we have like, so this is one of the things I really love about Sutra, is that it gives you the possibility of kind of doing a lot more that's fresh, which I think is really important. So that's another thing that I would say, whatever you're doing, just like interrupt it, make it fresh. If you've done 3 things in a row, then do something different.
Mm.
Um, because that's the way natural human relating is
Mm.
when we're awake.
Yeah, there's
We
something
can do
really
that. We can
interesting.
do that in the room, but technology kind of wants us to go into a kind of patterned way of
Hmm.
constructing. Yeah.
And there's an interesting counter side to that in a way I find, and I don't know if you relate to this, but I find in delivering a program, um, in some ways it's easier to be repetitive, but the repetition makes the content stale. And it's really
Yeah.
interesting how that works because the content can be awesome, but somehow if it doesn't evolve or somehow if the experience isn't fresh, it's just energetically stale. And I find that to be one of the most both demanding and enriching aspects of delivering a truly relational experience is that I
Yeah.
have to really be in fresh relationship with the material and the setup and the whole thing to have that quality of aliveness that makes it what it is. If I just take the
Yeah.
same stuff and just push it out the same way, it might have been amazing last time, but this time it's not. It doesn't have that. I just feel it. It's not the same like
Yeah.
aliveness to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I want to put in a word in favor of the duplicate duplicate course button. It's important to do what we do, in a way that's efficient and workable. It's like that has a positive impact because you can you, you can engage with more people and you can spend more time connecting with people and less time, editing and stuff like that. So there's a role for that. And but what you say is really important. I find it really important to like we're always tuning into, every time we do something, kind of looking at all the parts of it and zeroing in on those pieces that feel like, that really needs some evolution and then the sort of more subtle practice to what you're talking about, which to me is the kind of the master principle around this thing of keeping it fresh is that all of that coursework and all of those ideas and videos and text and all of that stuff that you have, all of the stuff that you're going to put people through at some level doesn't matter that much. What matters is actually your own freshness and engaging
Mm.
with it. And in a way, it's just a kind of reason to get people together and to throw some things into the mix. And then what you do with that, as you engage with people is what really matters. So um, it's kind of what happens in between the posts and in between the things that you need to say and do
Mm.
that really matters. So that's a kind of, to me, something that I really keep in mind. Yeah.
There's something really rich in what you're saying in I guess the if I were to say it in a I mean this is an exaggerated form, but all that stuff is really the reason that people come together to have the emergent experience. It gives them
Yeah.
it's why they it's what calls them there, but then it's the emergent experience that really offers the richness of the learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know we're so I know we have a hard stop in a few minutes here, but I want to close on one final question about what you have learned about working with small groups.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a big question, but I think what I'll say is to work, to work as a facilitator, to work with your own resistance to what's happening, to cultivate a comfort in yourself to be with whatever unfolds.
Hmm.
It's the most important thing.
Do you mean I kind of meant where you have a larger program that you break out into small groups. Is that
Okay.
what you were
Like
responding to?
break. No,
Well, like,
I just, well, it could be that too. Oh, you
hmm.
mean like reframe the question. Can
Yeah.
you
So
restate
you
it?
let's say you have a program of however many people, and then you put them into they might be called practice groups or support groups or
Yeah.
triads
Okay.
for their own
Like
little
independent groups.
integration process. If there's anything that you've learned about
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
what works and what doesn't work with the kind of
Mm,
with
mm,
um with these whatever self-moderated self
mm.
somehow
Okay.
organized groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. No, that's a little bit different question. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that, the and this kind of maybe applies to all of our work is there's a kind of in a way a kind of pattern we do, which is we bring people into a practice that interrupts the habitual ways of being and relating to each other, and then out of that field, um, do whatever we're there to do, whether it's kind of work or learning, and and then in that support a kind of deeper relational connection. So that practice at the outset of it is an important piece. And small groups, if you just throw people into small groups, with a question or something, that can be helpful, but you'll get a lot of kind of habitual patterning and relating at times. If you give people a practice, either before or in the group that has them deepen and interrupt the way they relate, maybe go into some kind of inquiry practice or a meditation practice or something like that, that can matter. And then the sort of paradox of that is to that whatever's happening is actually the work.
Mm.
So a bad small group experience is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
That's like if you work with that, that's really deep work, because everybody is always mostly just encountering themselves in these situations, and
Mm-hmm.
your design or your facilitation can't protect people from themselves,
Mm.
so it's to really go into that experience and kind of work with it, and sense what's possible in it, but also have compassion for yourselves and for them, and to be gentle and to sense what the learning might be out of those kind of situations.
Mm.
Yeah.
I resonate with that so much. I always say that what comes up is what there is to deal with. And I feel like that's the realness of the learning. It's like there's the
So important.
content, there's everything, but then when
Yeah.
stuff comes up, as inevitably does in a relational space, that's
Yeah.
that's the real stuff. That's what there is to
Yeah.
really work with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And that's what, that was kind of relevant to my first answer to your question was, to cultivate the willingness to be open to whatever's happening,
Mm. Mm.
and
Geoff,
always
thank
give
you
people their
so
money back.
That's true, and that's actually a great piece of wisdom is that if someone isn't happy with what's happening, I always stand by that.
Apologize.
It's like you can have a refund. Geoff, thank you so much for sharing your long career of deep embodied understanding in this conversation. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the work that you do, and I'm grateful to somehow be a part of it with Sutra.
Thank you so much, Lorenz. It's really, really good to talk with you. I appreciate it, and look forward to hearing everybody else's conversations as well.
Yeah, much love.